Well, ladies and gentlemen, the situation in the Middle East has just taken another very serious turn. And while many people might see this as just another headline in a long list of international tensions, the reality is that what's happening right now could have consequences that stretch far beyond Israel and Iran, far beyond the region, and straight into the global economy, global security, and even the cost of living for ordinary people around the world. Israel has announced that it has killed Alireza Tangsiri, the commander of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy. And this is not some minor military officer. This is a senior commander connected directly to operations around the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most strategically important waterways on the entire planet. Now, if you're wondering why the Strait of Hormuz matters so much, let me explain it very simply. Around 20% of the world's oil passes through that narrow stretch of water. That means 1 in every 5 barrels of oil used across the world travels through that single shipping route. So whenever anything happens there, a military incident, a blockade threat, a naval confrontation, oil markets react instantly. Fuel prices start rising, governments start worrying, and suddenly this becomes everyone's problem, not just a regional conflict. Israel's defense minister said that Tangsiri was directly responsible for activities involving blocking and threatening the Strait of Hormuz, and confirmed that he had been killed in what appears to be a targeted strike, using very blunt language, saying he had been blown up, which tells you a lot about the tone and seriousness of this situation. This is not quiet diplomacy. This is not subtle messaging. This is open confrontation and escalation. And the big question now, the question everyone in politics, military circles and financial markets is asking is very simple. How will Iran respond? Because historically, Iran does not absorb attacks on senior military figures quietly. Retaliation is usually calculated, sometimes delayed, but almost always comes in some form. And if retaliation targets oil infrastructure, shipping lanes, or military assets in the region, then we could very quickly see this situation spiral into something much larger and much more dangerous. And while the military side of this story is obviously extremely serious, what's equally important is the economic reaction that is already beginning to unfold. In Europe, Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk has already announced emergency measures to cut VAT and excise duty on fuel in order to protect drivers from rising fuel prices caused by instability in the Middle East. Think about that for a moment. Governments are not reacting to something that has already happened. They are reacting to what they believe is going to happen. Diesel prices have already risen dramatically. Petrol prices are climbing, and governments know exactly what happens when fuel prices go up. Transport becomes more expensive, food becomes more expensive, heating becomes more expensive, heating becomes more expensive, manufacturing becomes more expensive, and suddenly the entire economy feels the pressure. And when the economy feels pressure, governments feel political pressure. Because voters do not like rising costs, and they especially do not like rising costs caused by conflicts happening thousands of miles away that they have no control over. Meanwhile, in the United States, Donald Trump is expected to hold a cabinet meeting at the White House, and you can be absolutely certain that this situation involving Iran, Israel, and the Strait of Hormuz will be a major topic of discussion. Because for the United States, this is not just about foreign policy, it's about energy markets, military alliances, global trade routes, and geopolitical influence. Any instability involving Iran and the Strait of Hormuz immediately becomes a major strategic concern for Washington. And this is where the situation becomes particularly worrying, because when you start seeing targeted military strikes, rising oil prices, emergency economic measures in Europe, and emergency political meetings in Washington, all happening at the same time, it usually means governments are preparing for the possibility that this situation is not going to disappear quickly. The Strait of Hormuz is often described as a choke point, and that's exactly what it is, a narrow passage through which a huge portion of the world's energy supply must pass. If that passage becomes unsafe, restricted, or militarized, the consequences are immediate. Oil prices surge, shipping insurance costs skyrocket, companies pay more to transport goods, and those costs are passed directly to consumers. So while some people may see this story as just another military headline, the reality is that this is about global supply chains, global inflation, and global economic stability. And we also cannot ignore the broader geopolitical context here. Israel and Iran have been engaged in what many analysts call a shadow war for years: cyber attacks, proxy conflicts, intelligence operations, targeted strikes. But moments like this risk pushing that shadow war into open confrontation. An open confrontation between Israel and Iran would not remain limited to those two countries. Allies would be involved, regional tensions would explode, and global powers would be forced to take positions. And history shows us that when regional conflicts start involving major powers, things become far more unpredictable and far more dangerous. So the real question now is not just what happened today, but what happens next? Does Iran retaliate directly against Israel? Does it target shipping in the Strait of Hormuz? Does it use proxy groups in the region? Or does it respond economically or politically instead of militarily? Because whatever the response is, it will shape what happens over the next weeks and months. And this is why markets, governments, and military analysts are all watching this situation extremely closely right now. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just a geographic location, it is one of the most important economic pressure points in the world. Control it, threaten it, or destabilize it, and you affect oil prices, shipping routes, inflation, and global markets almost instantly. And that's why this story matters far more than many people probably realized when they first read the headline. This is not just about one commander being killed. This is about escalation, retaliation, oil supply, global markets, political pressure, and the possibility of a wider conflict that could affect economies and governments far beyond the Middle East. And if history has taught us anything, it is that conflicts involving energy supply routes and major regional powers rarely stay small for long. They tend to grow, they tend to pull other countries in, and they tend to affect the entire world in ways people do not expect at the beginning. So the world is now watching very carefully to see what Iran does next, how Israel responds to any retaliation, what the United States decides to do, and whether the Strait of Hormuz remains open and secure. Because if that narrow stretch of water becomes the center of a military confrontation, then this situation will move from being a regional conflict to being a global crisis very, very quickly. And that is why what happened today is not just another news story. It may turn out to be the beginning of a much bigger and much more dangerous chapter in global politics.